Statistically speaking, there are approximately 7,482,893,306 people currently living on the face of this green and blue globe we call our home. 4,436,000,000 of them live in Asia, 743,100,000 reside in Europe, and in America, a humble 318 million work, eat, sleep, and live their daily lives. A vast majority hop out of bed in the morning, comb their hair, and make their choice of breakfast, perhaps something simple for the day ahead, and step out of the place that they call home, wherever that may be. They'll walk, or take the subway, or a train, or their car to work, if they do work, which, as statistics show, most of them do. After work, they'll go home, kiss their partner, and play with their 2.5 children, statistically speaking. A dinner will be enjoyed, conversations about the day will be had, and the parents will retire for the evening, tucking their 2.5 children into their beds, saying good night, turning the lights out, and pulling the covers over their heads. Life, statistically speaking, is like this for us in America, and it will end, statistically speaking, with each of us dying. You're probably wondering why I chose to begin my essay with comments like that, dear listener. What I said before was basic and blatant fact, nothing more than mere observation that could be observed simply by being alive. There are quite a few people in the world. There are many people in America, most of whom work and make families and have children that they bring up to continue what they do. But there is a key part to understanding the rest of my statement that I'd like to make, that I urge you to come to terms with. We are all going to die. I hope you took a pause there, stepped away from this video for a moment, perhaps walked around a bit to think, picked up some food, made yourself a drink, changed your clothes, washed your hair, or whatever you do, in order to contemplate something. And if you didn't do any of that and have simply gone on to listening to my voice, I will do it once more to give you a chance. We are all going to die. That is the grand absurdity of life, that it ends. Ultimately, we will pass on from this state, and because there is an end, it begs the question, what's the purpose? If it has an end, then objectively there must be some reason as to why it began in the first place, at least we'd like to think. I realize this must sound terribly philosophical, and perhaps is running a little long for a first video, but this is precisely the track that I wish to be on. I will be discussing many things on this channel, like acting, literary analysis, current events, and politics, at least to a certain degree. But in all of these, hopefully, I hope to relate my personal philosophy of life, because my experience with life shapes very closely my identity. My experiences with literature began when I was very young, as it does with most people. I remember going to my local library often, and the respectable library that my mother curated herself in our basement, but this was not to read. I went to the library, and the library in my home, to look at the pictures. All I wanted was to pick out the heaviest and the thickest books that had the most beautiful pictures. I wanted to flip through the pages, not for their words, but before what was drawn, or photocopied onto them. Before I even learned how to say the word toucan, I could tell anyone that it was a winged creature with black feathers, deep-set eyes, clawed feet, and a brilliantly colored bill. Because of this, I mostly read the illustrated encyclopedias. They always had the best pictures to look at, the most interesting. After all, I could see so many fantastic things in an encyclopedia, far more things that I could see in a picture book or a rhyming story. The pictures in encyclopedias were real things that existed in the real, tangible, physical world. All those other books had story pictures that were much too fluff and not enough substance. I wanted to learn, after all, so why would I spend the eye strain looking at a minimalist interpretation of Jack and Jill use their round little fists to take a brown, boring pail of water up a half-finished hill? I had precious time on my 8-year-old hands, and the only reason that I would read anything would be to see what the picture was all about. Well, this may have doomed me to a life of considering the illustrated dictionary and pictorial thesaurus as the height of literary cuisine, but thankfully, my mother harbored a special book in her library that would introduce me not to just a passive understanding and a begrudging acceptance of the written word, but a deep love and a passion for reading. This would later become a keystone of my personal opinion towards life and the meaning of life. The book's name was Don Quixote, a title that I couldn't even pronounce at the time, but a name that I would come to fall in love with nonetheless. Outwardly, my copy of Don Quixote had shared many things with the other books that I read at the time. It was thick and impressive, with a weight to it that was comforting to hold in one's hand or on one's lap. At first I assumed it was a large Bible or some other holy book, because to me, that's what it must have looked like. Its cover was at least 1/4 of an inch thick, with gold lettering on the front that proudly displayed the title. The edge of every page was feathered in a thin layer of iridescent gold that caused the book to shine with every motion. It smelled old and musty, a scent that usually denotes a good read. However, I wasn't there to read at first. Of course, I was there for the pictures, and I was not disappointed. Upon opening the book, I was greeted to a spread of text that flowered over the page in a font that I didn't recognize. And I stared at the text itself, not reading at first, merely basking in the calligrapher's care that was taken to display the story. But I looked over to the next page and was greeted with this. Well, I was stunned, to say the least. The picture didn't make sense to me. Of course, I could understand what was going on in the picture. There was an old man who sat saddled on a bony horse with a set of ill-fitting plate armor and a lance in his left hand. Well, he appeared to be talking with a fatter, more reasonably dressed individual on a donkey or a mule of some kind as they passed through a canyon, but to me, this was absurd. I scanned the page again, trying to decipher what the picture was of. What confused me so much in that moment was the fact that no explanation was given. The books that I had read up to this point had always accompanied the text with a picture, or a definition, or a group of quick, succinct paragraphs that explained what was going on, but there was no footnote beneath the picture. No bolded word followed by a definition or a phrase, no stylized font that childishly explained what the old man was trying to accomplish on the horse anyway, or what he was doing in the canyon, or what the name of the donkey was, or what they were doing, or why they were doing it. I was baffled. For once in my 8 years of life, I was baffled. I had no context with which to put the picture other than the strict definitions that I had learned in my encyclopedias. Horse, man, donkey, canyon. Well, I knew what was going on in the picture, and the absurd thing was that because I knew what was in the picture, I expected to know what and how the picture depicted what it was depicting, but I had no idea. Well, following my viewing of the picture, I decided the only sensible thing was to put the book down and not touch it. For a week, I refused to even look at it. I couldn't concede that a piece of written literature would not have the decency to explain what was going on in it. I was left to stew with my own thoughts, and furious at the book as I was, I opened up one of the illustrated encyclopedias that my father had gotten me for a birthday to cool off. The first entry that I looked at was toucan. The bird was still the same bird that it always was, clawed feet and feathers, but I could have sworn that it looked at me with a vague, mocking glare as if to say, "Well done. The first real challenge you've ever had, and the only thing that you can do is come back to me." Well, I promptly put the encyclopedia back and walked downstairs. Don Quixote was where I had left it, haphazardly put back on the shelf. I toddled over and picked it up. I paused once more at the covers. I ran my finger over the bindings and flipped through the pages to watch the iridescent gold dance, and opened it to the picture. It was still there, of course, the old man, the fat man, the horse, and the donkey, and the canyon, and all of them right where they should be. And for the first time, I looked away from the picture and read. Somewhere in La Mancha, in a place whose name I do not care to remember, a gentleman lived not long ago, one of those who had a lance and ancient shield on a shelf and keeps a skinny nag and a greyhound for racing. I read to myself. I stopped thinking for a moment and looked back to the page, and as I did so, I realized two things. First, the picture on the page was not at all described in the text. And secondly, the text gave me a picture all on its own. I was shocked for what felt like the longest time. My conception of what a book was and what a book should be was changed, and in that moment, I realized the power of words and how inspiring they can really be. Setting the initial picture that I had made in my mind aside, I turned back to the book and read onwards. And that began my love of Don Quixote. I discovered a man named Alonso Quijano, a minor lord who ruled over a moderate estate, and, like me, had a fondness for books. So fond, in fact, that he had rotted his mind away by reading endlessly, dreaming of the days of yore that were described in his books, the days of knighthood and chivalry, nobility and quests where magic made the world young, fresh, and alive, waiting for the most worthy to explore it. And so Alonso Quijano dubbed himself Don Quixote, Knight of La Mancha, taking to himself a squire in the bumbling but charming field-hand Sancho, and swearing himself to the lovely Lady Dulcinea, who was in fact a neighboring farm girl. Well, I was enraptured by this story, and over the course of the next several weeks I'd slowly take the time that I could read to finish the book in its entirety. I pressed onwards, relishing each word, sometimes forgetting to even glance at the pictures as I feasted on the story. I was given purpose and direction as I pored over dancing fights between doctors disguised as knights, windmills that seemed to be giants, betrayal, love, and honor. However, my eagerness to finish the story would soon turn to a more somber desire, an anxiety for what I would discover. Ultimately, I found that Quixote's fantasies couldn't hold. And though he charged after the giants that he saw in windmills and found himself a castle in the local inn, the windmills remained windmills, and the inn remained the same inn that it always was. Each and every time Don Quixote sallied out, ready to take the world in his stride, the world spit him back to his estate, beaten, bruised, and by the end, crushed. And I was not prepared for that ending. By the final chapter, I expected more of the same sallies and escapades between Don Quixote and his loyal squire, more adventure and misadventure, more of the humor and tragedy. I wanted more, but all I got was Alonso Quijano at his bed, old and dying, surrounded by family and friends, most of whom sought to end his sallies anyway. The knight that I had spent all this time reading about was no longer there, only the wizened, frail man. The final chapter consisted not of a high fantastical adventure, but a very slow death. Alonso's death, the man that had died condemning the same books that he had read and inspired his escapades to being burned. I was left with this image. And I wasn't quite sure what to do after that. I had spent so much time and so much of my thoughts on the book itself. I was so invested in that story that I had expected it must end with some sort of satisfying conclusion, that the noble Don Quixote, who had sacrificed anything and everything, including his life, would be rewarded, that those who had doubted him would see the errors of their way, and that in some sense the fantasy would become reality. After all, the greatest extent of loss in a literary sense that I had ever seen up to this point was Jack and Jill and their poor inability to get water without receiving bodily harm. And every other story that I had read or had heard about was a happy ending. Snow White marries her handsome prince, Hansel and Gretel outsmart the wicked witch, and the mouse gets a cookie despite all the convoluted steps that one would have to take. But there was no happy ending here. Don Quixote was dismissed as a fool, Alonso burned the books he read. Even Sancho seemed numb to the passing of his friend. This was no fairy tale death, no bubbling pool of smoke that the witch melts into when Dorothy pours water on her, no jail to put the robbers into, and no horse on which the hero rides off into the sunset. It was the real death of a fictitious man whom I saw as real themselves. Even the death was slow. 3 days of waiting for it to happen before finally Alonso passed on. Just as I had started the book with my worldview changing, I ended the book with a change in how I perceived life. It was in that moment that I realized something that I said earlier, and something that I will return to now. We are all going to die. Death is a very real and very unfortunate result of being alive. And in my mother's library at 8 years old, I had the epiphany that my parents were going to die. My siblings were going to die. My teachers, my friends, my classmates were all going to die. And at some point, I would die as well. And the meaning of life would be that there was, in fact, no meaning at all. Needless to say that as an 8-year-old, I was unsure of how to react. Like a character out of some cosmic horror story, I had to live with this strange, almost alien knowledge, at least to my mind, knowing that if anyone else had come to the same realization that I had, they must have gone mad or run away. I felt alone in a philosophical sense, not that I was better than others for having determined this, but rather wanting to return to that state of ignorance where I could ignore the pointlessness of life. But I couldn't forget Don Quixote, even though I tried. It bothered me for quite some time, burrowing away into my subconscious and making a home for itself, comfortably, in the back of my thoughts. It was only later on in life that I would resolve to solve this issue by striking it at the roots. I reread Don Quixote, now armed with a decade's worth of life experience for my second time, and what struck me in the second reading was similar but not the same. A doppelganger idea, identical in shape but not in form. We are not all going to live. Reading the story once more, I found that yes, Alonso does perish by the end, doing away with his books and his estate and leaving his friends behind in a slow and very real process that could happen to any of us at any time, but it is what Alonso did as Don Quixote which truly stuck with me. In the face of the grand absurdity of life, in its pitfalls and its shortcomings, in its tragedies and chaos, and ultimately in the lack of inherent or given purpose in life itself, the great idiot, the perfect fool, Don Quixote found meaning. Every failure was met with the will to try again. Every unknown was challenged despite the fear, and the fantasy, the beauty, and the mystery of life that we so often skip over was found. The grand absurdity is that in life, in order to find meaning, one must make meaning. This can be done in many ways, be it through the following of religion and devoting oneself fully to a cause that betters the individual and others, to creating art and interpreting absurdity by giving it physical form, to produce acts of civil service to change and improve the world, and to study the mysteries and beauties of our planet through the sciences and mathematics. But for me, that meaning is in culture, in the enjoyment of it and the creation of it in its many forms, of its power and ability to change and improve our existence. For me, that has always given me purpose in life. Statistically speaking, the average person will read around 5,000 pieces of literature of various formats in their lives. Statistically speaking, the majority of this will be nonfiction or editorial in nature, and if it is fiction, the fantasy genre will be the most popular choice of the 5,000 books. They will truly like less than half of these, and be able to name less than 50 of them at a given time, statistically speaking. Of the 2.5 children that the average individual in America will have, they will enjoy reading approximately none of the same 5,000 pieces of literature that their parents read, and if they do, they should really broaden their horizons. or at least seriously consider why they enjoy them. Daily, of the 318 million people that currently reside in America, 1.5 million of them will take their time to visit a local library and check out a book to read. They will then, hopefully, return the book and come home with another in about 2 to 3.5 weeks, statistically speaking. But there is no number for the people who will find the meaning of life. No integer that a census taker can come up with that will represent the approximate number of those who will have died knowing what the meaning of life is. There is no percentage, no decimal dot, and no abstract or obscure numerical value that will describe the statistics of purpose. That is up to us, the world's few Don Quixotes, to determine. It will always be up to us. Well, boy howdy, this is the King in Yellow, and that was my first video. If you enjoyed it, feel free to leave a like or a comment down below if you have anything to tell me. And if you would like to support more content like this, feel free to subscribe. Hopefully in the future I won't be as verbose and perhaps a little bit more analytical. I've got my next video in the works should be about the Book of Mormon musical, which will hopefully tick off a lot of musical theater fans as I analyze it. But I'll be seeing you around, hopefully. And until then, I wish you the best.